Thanks, Marianne. Nirvana?
Hello. This is Nirvana, Director Byler's assistant, and I am here to provide technical assistance.
Thanks, Nirvana. And then Harney County, because it's the Zoom, and then of course the feed here that shows Ivan. So the goal of the meeting today is just to have a high-level discussion, first on what is water law, prior appropriation, and how does the department articulate that to us. Secondly, it'll be more specifically on the Silvies decree. How does the department regulate the Silvies decree? How does the system work, and what is in the decree? Nothing in this meeting is to try to persuade anybody to change water law, to change the decree. Your rights are there, prior appropriation is there. None of this is going to spin off in a discussion on how to change that. We want to figure out what is and how is the decree managed, so people have a better understanding of what their water right is and potentially when and how they can get water. So that's the sideboards. The people that are putting on this meeting is the Farm Bureau, Marianne Cooper, the NRAC that works for the County Natural Resource Advisory Committee, Kristen Shellman, and I've been asked to come and facilitate the conversation. We'll start with about 20 minutes on water law, then we'll go into 15 minutes of the decree. We have two people from the department that have joined us, Jason and Ivan. Jason, you're from?
I'm from Baker City. I'm the East Region Manager for Water Resources Department.
Ivan?
I'm Ivan Gall. I'm the Field Services Division Administrator out of our Salem office.
We're not going to get into specifics of user versus user and specific ditches. If you ask questions on those lines, I'm going to tell you no. If you ask questions that are about the holistic management, we're going to encourage those. We have some pre-submitted questions the department will work through. We have an opportunity because there's time built in. If you got a question that you're confused on during the presentation, raise your hand, we'll take it then. If you have a more general question, please hold it to the end so we can make sure we get through the questions that have been submitted prior. Any questions?
Maybe one other thing. I'm going to set this at the back table so as people leave, if they could.
There's a sign-in sheet that I put at the back table. I didn't have an extra pen, so hopefully somebody put a pen there and you can sign in. We will try to spam you. We will try to, oh, never mind. No, we'll just try to use it for follow-up meetings on the conversation. The department has articulated that they have no problem coming into the basin once or twice a year. So after we formulate questions that we have, concerns that we have, and how we want to work through the management, they've committed to working through us. So right now, I'll turn it over to.
Hey, who are you?
Me. Good question.
Introduce yourself.
Good question. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mark Gold. I'm state representative for House District 60. I'm a farmer outside of Crane. Been in water conversations, mainly groundwater, for the last 6 years. This is not about the groundwater conversation. This is just strictly water law. Thank you. I should have done that. Who are you?
I'm Lowell.
All right. Before we get started, it looks like most of you picked up copies of the PowerPoint presentation. I apologize. I didn't realize when I printed it out that the text was going to be so small. I certainly have trouble reading some of it. We can get you the actual PowerPoint presentation if you do want a copy of that. Jason printed out about 10 copies of what we call our Silvies Distribution Map. So those are there for the taking. Try and spread them out amongst the neighborhoods so they don't all end up in one part of the basin there. But they do give a really nice bird's eye view of the system and its distributaries, some of the dams, and more importantly, by quarter section, the water rights and the priority dates. And so you can see what a patchwork it is and what the water master has to deal with as we're trying to get water to senior lands. And we'll talk more about that later. Nirvana, can we have the next slide, please? So what Jason and I wanted to cover tonight, I'll kind of take the first half of the presentation and then he'll get more into the decree details, is kind of a general look at Oregon water law and our permitting system, and then the decree system and what's different between those. We're really here tonight, I think, to focus in on the Sylvies River decree. So the permitting side, we'll move through that pretty quickly, but some components of that are important to some of you, so we wanted to make sure and touch on that. what you're looking at here are really some of the foundations of Oregon water law. All waters of the state were made by the legislature a long time ago to be public waters. Oregon follows the system of prior appropriation. So you've heard us talk about that in the past, first in time, first in right. So water rights are assigned a priority date, either through the decree process or through the permitting process. And that priority date dictates whether you get water in times of shortage or not. The senior users, the oldest water rights, are afforded the opportunity to get water during times of shortage, and junior rights are generally regulated off or shut off or curtailed back at some point in order to get water to those senior users there. 1909 is when we got the first water code here in the state of Oregon that dealt primarily with surface water. There's 4 basic provisions of that, and we'll go through that in a little bit here. And then we talk about the water rights system. So other than the decree process, we deal with applications today. Your application is reviewed, you get a permit, you prove up on that permit, you get a certificate. So we'll talk more in a little bit detail about those as well. Next slide, please. I think you're all aware of this, but just to make sure we're all crystal clear, Oregon's water resources, the volumes, the amounts are managed by the Water Resources Department. We don't really deal with water quality directly on a day-to-day basis. Aspects of our agency do deal with water quality. We have well construction rules that are protective of groundwater quality. We don't want wells commingling aquifers or having real shallow seals that allow surface contamination to get down into the water bearing zones. And we do work with our sister agency of DEQ on permits and reviews there. But generally, we deal with water quantity, not so much the quality. Next slide, please. This is a map of the state of Oregon at the scale from where you're sitting. It's going to be pretty hard to see, but these are the adjudicated areas within the state. And everything you can see on here is a surface water adjudication. There's only been one groundwater adjudication done, and it's down on the harbor bench. It's probably 2 miles wide and maybe 4 miles long. So it's about the skinniest strip of land in the state. It was adjudicated back in the 1970s. Everything else in the state that's been adjudicated is surface water. Here in the Malheur Lake Basin, the adjudications that were done were the Silvies River, Silver Creek, Mill and Coffee Pot Creeks, Rock Creek, Cow Creek, Malheur River, Donner and Blitzen, and Trout Creek. So even some of the smaller streams that come out of the hills from the north had their own individual adjudications on that. So what does it mean to be adjudicated? Well, back in the 1800s, water use began in this state. And when the state of Oregon set up the water code in 1909, they had to build into it a process to recognize the prior uses that began before we got to the permitting system. And that was this adjudication process, and ultimately results in the circuit court in a basin issuing a decree that characterizes the water rights that came forward. So landowners back then would submit claims. Those claims would go through a number of processes to be vetted amongst neighbors. Evidence was submitted by the landowner, evidence was submitted by the neighbors. The state engineer kicked in information. All of this information then was worked through the decree court, which was in Harney County Circuit Court, and the decree was issued in about 1926. The last couple of slides in this PowerPoint presentation, I tried to capture it. They show you how to get to the actual decree online from our website. Again, the text is horribly small. I apologize for that, but Jason was indicating most of you know how to get to it anyways, so it's probably not a big deal. But the decree process was done here in the local circuit court. Any changes to the decree have to be done here at that circuit court level as well. And so any future actions are going to occur in the circuit court. Nirvana, next slide, please. So to kind of contrast that decree process with the post 1909 permitting process, this is a slide that just kind of quickly shows you again, a landowner who wanted a new water right on their property would submit an application to the Water Resources Department. It goes through a review. If it passes the test, a permit is issued. And generally, you're given 5 years to develop that permit, to grab the water, to put it to the beneficial use that you applied for. And then you end up hiring, in today's world, a certified water rights examiner who will help you fill out and submit a claim of beneficial use. That goes back to Salem, gets reviewed by our staff, and ultimately a water rights certificate is issued. That holds true for surface water rights, groundwater rights, and storage rights. The process is all generally the same. Again, these are going to be for water uses that were developed after 1909. Generally, most of the decreed water rights around the state have pre-1909 dates, but there's lots of examples where that's not the case. But certainly later water rights went through this application and permitting process there. In the event that you want to change something about your water right, that's kind of what the last two little boxes there get to. You can go through a transfer process. So you can apply for a transfer. You can pick up your irrigated ground and move it to a different footprint. That's what we call a transfer in the place of use. If you need to drill a new well because your old well is failing, you'll file a transfer application to add a well to that water right. Or if the old well is still good, you can add a second well to it. So you've actually got multiple wells now, if it's a groundwater right. On a stream system, if you need to move your point of diversion up or down the stream, that's a transfer process. So I think that pretty much covers it. Non-use we'll talk about here shortly. Nirvana, next slide, please. So digging in a little bit more to some of the pillars of the water code here in Oregon. We're going to talk about each of these kind of individually. Beneficial use without waste is the first one. Then there's a priority date, there's a pertinency, and the use component of that water right. Nirvana, next slide, please. So beneficial use is defined as the reasonably efficient use of water without waste for a purpose consistent with the laws and the best interests of the people of the state. More simply, kind of on the right-hand side of the slide there, you can see what a lot of the common beneficial uses are that we're talking about. Irrigation, industrial, domestic, municipal. In-stream became beneficial use in more recent years there. So, you know, there really is no limitation on what can be considered a beneficial use. We've got, I think, dozens of them listed in our system, but it's really one of the key parts that I want to emphasize there is your use has got to occur without waste, so it can't be excessive. Next slide, please. The priority date, I touched on this earlier. So again, because the state of Oregon follows the doctrine of prior appropriation, we've established a system both through the decree process and the permitting process there, where each of the water rights is assigned a priority date. And the older the water right that is, the more senior the water right is. And again, in times of shortage, when there's not enough water to go around for all the users on a particular system, and a senior user will make a call for water, those junior users can be regulated off by the water master there. That doesn't matter whether it's a decreed right or permitted rights. We'll regulate permitted rights to protect decreed rights. We'll regulate decreed rights to protect other more senior decreed rights. And that's typically what happens here in the valley for the Silvies River system there. Next slide, please. Appurtenancy is a term that we talk about a lot associated with water rights. So a water right is generally tied to a specific parcel of land. Most of what we'll be talking about tonight are irrigation rights, so that makes a lot of sense. Water rights today will have a specific footprint. The decree was not very detailed in its mapping of a number of things, points of diversion, the location of ditches, certainly not the exact places of use. But we translate the what we call the place of use being equal to the footprint of the water right. Where can you divert the water and put the water to the beneficial use? Where can you irrigate at? That's within the footprint of your water right. And so if you have a decreed right for 40 acres, it's typically going to be tied to the state's survey system. And historically, we've tabulated water rights using township, range, section, and then the quarter. So each quarter is a 40-acre parcel. We have a system that tracks the acres of irrigation in each quarter. So if it's a full quarter, typically you'll see 40 acres of irrigation. That means the whole quarter is covered there. In the event that there are not accurate maps for that place of use, and the system we have indicates that only half of 20 acres, as an example, in a quarter are irrigated, we're going to use the best available information we can come up with to try and determine where that's at. Generally, it doesn't come up a lot, but in areas of the state where we've had a lot of subdividing going on, and now you've got multiple owners trying to figure out how many acres of the water right do they have, that's where we end up running into some struggles and some challenges trying to get the details figured out there. Next slide, please. Kind of the last part of the water code is the use component. So in Oregon, if you don't use your water right for 5 consecutive years, that water right is subject to forfeiture. Any of those 5 years fall within a 15-year period. So it can go back as far as 19 years, I think, if I'm doing my math right. It could be subject to forfeiture. So again, the whole system is based upon beneficial use without waste. If you have a water right, use it. Otherwise, the system was designed to put it back in stream and let it go down to the next user, or allow other users to come in and grab it. It's not one to be parked on and not using it and hold that paper right there. So again, there's that use component of it. What's key to understand is if the water's not available to you to use, you don't have to worry about the forfeiture clause. So as long as you're ready, willing, and able to take it, your dam is there, your ditch is there, your ditch is cleaned out and it's there, and you're ready to irrigate, but your priority date's not valid, you don't have to worry about forfeiture. It's only when your supply is there on a regular basis and you just don't take it anymore, you don't divert it, you don't irrigate with it, you certainly don't put it to the beneficial use, that's when it's subject to a forfeiture issue at that point in time. Our agency does not actively go after forfeiture. Sometimes neighbors will come after other neighbors for that issue, but the cases turn out to be pretty rare. They are a big endeavor when someone alleges forfeiture, though, because it takes a lot of evidence to get that through, and usually you end up at a contested case hearing, which takes a lot of time and evidence on both parties' sides there. So Nirvana, next slide, please. So wanted to touch on some of the specific elements of a water right. This is going to be a decreed water right or one that comes through our permitting or certificate process there. The source of water is always key. Again, generally, we're going to have groundwater as your source if you're using wells or sumps, surface water if you're using a creek or a stream, or stored water. So with respect to stored water, we'll typically issue a water right to store water in a reservoir or a pond. And then if you want to use that stored water, you would get a secondary water right to divert the water from that pond and put it onto land to irrigate it, as an example. But the source of water is always key and generally is very specific for the water rights. In the case of the Silvies River Decree, some of the decree terms turn out to be fairly broad. The Silvies River can be named as the source on a number of different parts of the basin. Well, when you go back and look at the map, you'll see that, and you're all aware, the Silvies River, as it comes out of the canyon from the north, there's a major distributary there, the Foley Slough, which takes water south and east and south. And then as the main Silvies comes further south, it breaks into the East Fork and the West Fork. Some of the decreed rights are specific. Some are just more generic and say Silvies. It's all Silvies River water, but it helps the water master to be as specific as possible so we know how much water going down a particular channel is needed to meet certain priority dates if those sources are listed there. Points of diversion or appropriation. So for wells, we talk about a point of appropriation. For surface water, it's a point of diversion. So a point of diversion is the location on a stream or a river where you actually take control of the water and pull your share of the water out of the source. Again, specific to the Silvies Decree, there's a number of dams, number of ditches that are listed in the decree. Others are fairly generic and just talk about dams and ditches for those quarters over there. Specificity is always helpful to the water master there. We've talked about places of use, but that's where the water is applied. And again, the more accurate those are mapped, the better we are able to check compliance and monitor that the water's going on the appropriate acres there. Move on to next slide, please. So one of the things we were asked to explain is the process by which a water master is going to get a call for water by a senior user. And I'll put the term call in quotes here. That's really a request by a water right holder, and it could be any water right holder, to have water delivered to their point of diversion. That call typically comes today in the form of an actual phone call or an email, text message, running into a water user at the store, any number of different ways there. It's not really a formal process. And the more a water master works in a basin and understands how a system works, they develop a pretty good sense as to when calls are going to start coming in based on the available supply and historical usage in a particular basin. When the water master gets a call, they need to verify that call. They need to check the validity of it. And so our typical process to do that is to go to the person's point of diversion who's making a call and check the amount of water available for them on the stream to divert. If there's enough water available for that person to divert, then the water master can't validate that call and they're not going to do any regulation or distribution. We've determined that there's adequate water available at that POD for that water right holder, and they have to go get it. They either have to put boards in their dam, build a dam, fix their pump, lower their pump, move their pump, whatever it is. We're not going to bring the water to them. They have to go get it as long as it's available to them in the source, at the source, in the right location there. If the water master verifies that there's inadequate water at the point of diversion for that water right holder, then a whole bunch of things start to happen. The water master will do an assessment of the total supply to the system based on the priority date of the person making the call, and let's assume it's a senior user. They will assess the supply of water available. They'll assess the priority dates that are entitled to get that water, and then they'll start doing what we call the regulation or distribution process. They'll start either physically going and shutting off junior users upstream, or they'll pick up the phone and call and say, hey, we've got a valid call from a senior user downstream. I need you to cut back or shut off your ditch, up at the highway there. It works either way. The more cooperation the water master gets, the more quickly we can do the regulation distribution. Then we reassess. We go back to the senior's point of diversion. Do they have enough water there? If they do, and it's just the right amount, then the water master did things perfectly. If there's too much water there and some is passing the senior's point of diversion, then the water master will turn on some of the junior users that were regulated off in order for that water to be used. If there's not enough water to satisfy the senior call, then the water master will have to cut deeper into that priority list and cut off some more of the senior junior users, if that makes sense. She'll keep cutting deeper in time, more and more senior priority dates to get that water down to that senior user. Other factors that the water master takes into consideration: what's the weather looking like in the next 3 or 4 days? If there's a big front coming in and we know we're going to get precipitation and we know stream flows are going to come up, we can be ready to turn people back on. We can talk to the junior users and say, hey, if we do get that inch of rain like it's forecast, we know stream flows are coming up, you can be prepared to take more water in 2 or 3 days, whatever the case is. If at some point in time, you've probably all heard the term futility or futile call. If at some point in time, the water master has regulated off all the upstream junior users and there's no usable quantity of water getting down to that senior point of diversion, the water master will make what's called a futile call. We've shut off juniors, they're not getting their water, water's flowing past their points of diversion, and for whatever reason, it's not getting to the senior point of diversion. A lot of systems in different parts of the state have what we call losing reaches. So there's significant channel losses where it just subs out into the channel bottom, or ends up getting evaporated away because of the miles of channel and everything. So if we can't get that water in usable quantities to the senior user, the water master will start turning on junior users upstream so they can use the water that's available at that point, at their points of diversion there. Okay, Nirvana, next slide, please. Some additional components of water rights. These again are decreed rights or permitted rights. You'll hear us use the term rate and duty all the time. The rate is the instantaneous amount of water that you're allowed to divert, both per acre and in total. So you'll typically see that, well, in Eastern Oregon, there's a couple different ways. The old decrees talk about miners inches or fractions of a CFS, cubic foot per second. So a lot of decree rates in Eastern Oregon range between an 80th and a 60th. So an 80th is 1/80th of a cubic foot per second, which is about 5.6 gallons per minute. A 60th is more than 5.6 gallons per minute. Didn't do the math in my head, but what that means is at an 80th, you need 1 cubic foot per second for 80 acres. At a 60th, you get the same amount of water for 60 acres. So a 60th is a higher rate. It's more water that you can divert per acre. And so if you have 4 acres and the decree allows an 80th, you get 4 80ths for your point of diversion. That's how much water you're entitled to divert, and that's the rate. The duty, on the other hand, is the total amount of water that you get to stack on your land throughout the course of the irrigation season. And those in Eastern Oregon typically range between 2.5 and 3 or 3.5 acre feet per acre. In different basins, they're as high as 8 or 10. I think I've even seen some as high as 11 acre feet per acre. And that was a recognition by the decree court. Clearly, you can't beneficially use that on your land, but the system losses in some of the leaky canals were so bad that they had to divert 11 acre feet in order to deliver 3 acre feet to the properties there. Very, very inefficient systems there. So again, rate and duty are basically the limitation as to how much you can divert right now. And that's typically what the water master's checking when she's checking for compliance out there. When we're doing regulation and distribution, the other thing that the water master is doing is going to everybody's point of diversion and make sure they're diverting only what they're entitled to. We do that in the Silvies system. We have some large ditches that divert for multiple landowners. We know how many acres of each priority date are down those ditches. So we can come up accurately with what the allowed diversion rate is at the head of that ditch, adjust it, and then move on. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to get into, I think, more details of the Silvies River Decree. So Jason, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Before we go to Jason, is there any specific questions specifically on water rights that Ivan can go back on to, or maybe it wasn't clear? Most of you have seen your water rights, you probably know. Steve.
They talk about the irrigation season. What are you referring to?
So generally, the irrigation season, and Jason will talk a little bit more about it specific to the Silvies here. The irrigation season is established in a basin and is generally pretty uniform. And the approach that the agency has taken historically, because the decrees handled a lot of the early water rights and most decrees set irrigation seasons, then a lot of the permitted rights that came after that would oftentimes follow the same season. And those seasons vary, I wouldn't say they vary widely, but there's lots of different irrigation seasons around the state, depending on the basin that you're in. The way the Silvies decree touches yours is probably the most unique, but if you have an irrigation water right, you really can't divert before the season begins, and you can't divert after the season ends. It's pretty strict. There are other people have gotten additional water rights in other basins to do kind of wintertime wetting of soil. So if water's available, they'll try and divert water and put it on the ground to wet it up. Sometimes that helps to get it farmed up in the spring or even in the late fall after the irrigation season. Sometimes it's just some insurance in the event you have a drought, the following year, you've at least got some water on the ground there. So does that answer your question, Steve?
General. Maybe the decree will tell us more about the season issued in the decree.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
What are the specific dates of the season start?
Is that handled in the decree specific dates? That'll be handled in the decree section. Any other questions? I have one. So in a flood irrigation system, what would be an example of considered waste, not beneficial use?
In most basins, stacking too much water up underground is a problem. And that's an issue. So I worked out of the Baker City office for 4 years and spent a lot of time down here between 2007 and 11. And because your fields are not laser leveled, and because of the nature of the flooding that goes on, some people try and back flood their ground. So you may have 18 to 24 inches of water stacked on the lower end of your field in order to get 6 inches stacked on the upper end of your field. That lower end of the field is waste. It's not a beneficial use. And so we recognize that. What we don't have is a handy tool to deal with it. It's a necessity. It's been something that's gone on for 150 years down here. But you can't beneficially use 24 inches of water at one time on your ground. That 24 inches of water should be distributed over the course of about 4 or 5 months. But that's not how your system operates. When the Silvies dumps water, it's there for days, it's there for weeks if we're lucky, sometimes a month. But you know, Jason will get into that more. The decree recognized kind of the wild nature of how the snow melt comes off on a good year, and it doesn't sync up real well with the beneficial use without waste part of our system. So.
All right, we're ready. All right, I tend to be a little less verbose than Ivan, so I can jump in if you think there's anything missing. Or if there's any questions I'm not answering here.
Can you hear Jason?
No.
No, okay.
You're gonna have to.
I'll try to be a little bit louder here. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the decree allows for a rate of an 1/80th of a CFS on the Silvies River itself. And you can find a lot of that information in the decree. So I'd encourage all you guys that are curious about this, if you haven't already, to go ahead and look up a copy of the decree, which we'll get to some of that off the website if you know where that is, or we'll show you here in a little bit where you can find that information. The decree itself is fairly simple for a decree. I mean, there's a lot of you have to read through it a few times to understand the language because it's 100 years old. And so, you know, it's just the way people spoke back then was a little bit different than a lot of folks do today. So it takes a little bit of research to find out. And a lot of things are repetitive in the decree. So they'll talk about the season, the rates, the duties, that kind of stuff multiple times throughout the decree. But what it gets to is the Silvies River itself. So the main stem of the Silvies, the rate on the main stem is 1/80th of the CFS, as Ivan mentioned, and the total duty is only 2 cubic feet per second, or 2 acre feet. So it's not a lot of water, and I believe the reason for that is just the flashy nature of the system. The decree court recognized that they wanted to get as many folks wet as possible that had claims out in this area, so it's a very limited amount of water. But we'll get a little bit more into that as well. And then all the tributaries of the Silvies are allowed a little bit more water. It's a 60th cubic feet per second, but also still 2 acre feet per acre. So same total amount of water, but they're allowed to take a little bit more all at once at a rate. So the flow rate is a little bit higher on the tributaries like Sageham Creek or Coffee Pot Creek, etc. And you can find that in the decree findings number 33 if you want to look at that yourself. And the rate and duty are measured at your point of diversion from that source. So if you have a Silvies River water right, your rate is measured at your ditch, where your ditch comes out of that source. Or if you're on one of the sloughs or another creek, it's measured at that source where you take it out right at the head of your ditch. Additionally, I put in our Oregon revised statute 540.045, which is water master duties, and it talks a little bit about that the regulation and distribution of water among various users are from any natural surface water or groundwater supply. Next slide, please. So this slide, I'm not going to go through the fine details. Again, this is just a photo of the decree. I believe this is findings number 33, where it talks about the 1/80th and 2 cubic feet or 2 acre feet for the Silvies River, and then the 1/60th and 2 acre feet for the Tribs. But additionally, the Silvies River decree gives you a little more flexibility on high flow periods. So when there's high flow periods, it talks about how users are allowed to take a little bit more water than the rate. So like when we have the spring freshet, we're not going to hold folks to your 1/80th because there's water all over the place. So we have a good water year and there's tons of water flowing out, and people are diverting a 40th or 20th of their cubic feet per second per acre, and there's enough water to go around, then that's allowed by the decree. So you can actually divert a little bit more than your 1/80th rate when there's enough water for everyone. I'll talk just a little bit about stock water. It also includes stock water. So stock water is included in the amount of water that you're diverting for irrigation during the irrigation season. So if you're diverting water, that includes stock. You don't get additional water for stock, but outside the irrigation season, you do get stock water, and that stock water is limited to 1/10 of a CFS per 1,000 head of stock. So, and 1/10 of a CFS per 1,000 head isn't a lot of water. So the decree does allow a little bit of a push of water on top of that to get water to the stock in most cases. So, next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about our head gate and measuring device requirements. There's revised statutes that give water resources the authority to require head gates and measuring devices in order to distribute water throughout the entire state. But the Silvies River decree also talks about the water master having the authority to require head gates and measuring devices. So in specific language, it says to divert an appropriation of water for said land. So on all of your points of diversion, all of the takeouts from the sources, the water master has the authority to go ahead and require those distribution or head gates measuring devices throughout the whole system. On top of that, in general, what we've been doing in the past in this valley is we've tried to keep things as simple as possible. Because of the flat nature of the valley, it's tough to get a really good measurement with a typical measuring device. So what we've done in the past is we have required things like submerged orifices that are just a 2-gate system in order to measure water. So it doesn't disrupt the flow enough that it could make it difficult for folks to get water through it. So we have to use really low gradient type measuring devices. Other times we've required like a U-shaped concrete box in the channel, which we can put it's not as accurate, but we can put a measuring device called a staff gauge on the side that will measure the depth of the water going through that box. And we can rate that by going out and doing manual measurements in the box at different types of, or different flow depths. And over time, we can create what's called a rating curve, which will tell us about how much water is flowing through those boxes at any given moment just by looking at the water depth. So we can get a pretty good idea doing that. And that's another way we can do it without having to hamper, the system and actually stop water or back water up. Whereas a more high gradient system, a flume or some sort of weir that backs water up and then flows over is actually a little bit simpler design to put in some cases compared to submerged orifices, or it can be a little more accurate as well. Next slide, please. So this slide talks a little bit, this is also a section in the decree. I think it's also findings 33, but it talks about the irrigation season. So the official Silvies irrigation season is March 1st to September 1st. But again, recognizing the nature of the system, the decree allows some flexibility there. When the spring freshet comes out, water's everywhere, but it happens in February. It's okay, we've in the past and historically, decree allows for you guys to go ahead and then pull water at that time if you can put it to beneficial use. Usually we like to let things run down the channels as much as possible during the low flow times, the winter time, early spring, to get things wetted up so water travels a little bit better down those channels. So we like to keep that in as much as possible. But once you can start using it for beneficial use, you're allowed to take some water. We don't typically start distribution or regulation until March 20th. Next slide, please. So here I'll get a little bit into what the flow in the Silvies has looked like in the past. So in this slide, you'll see a dark line going kind of through the middle of that rainbow of graph there. That dark line is the 2021 water year, and it was about 33, about in the 33rd percentile of average. So 33, what that means is, and I have to teach myself this because I'm not a great math wizard, but so 33 years out of 100, it's going to be at least the same or drier than it was in 2021. So 67 years out of 100, it's going to be wetter, or it has in the past, over the past almost 100 years from 1925 to 2021. So this is a dry year, as you guys know, this year, and this graph sort of depicts that. Seeing that dark line right there at the bottom of the green. The green is between 25 and 75th percentile.
Point out the y-axis.
Oh yeah, you see the y-axis shows the flow in CFS and how it varies greatly, you know, up to 1,000 in some years, and then they're down to right here you see 1. So there's an exponential rise here.
Maybe a little louder again, Jason.
Oh, sorry. So we've got just the various water years here throughout the last 100 years or so, and it shows the variance in between, you know, where we've been at our lowest to where we've been at our highest over these past 100 years or so. And this is the stream flow amount over that time and the months. And so when our typical high water months are March, April, May, you know, we've been upwards of 1,000 CFS on the really good years, and as low as, you know, under 10 on some of the lowest water years in the past. Okay, next slide, please. So this is an example of a good water year. This was 2011. This is the beginning of the valley up here. You can see the gravel pit clear up here in the corner as you're going up the canyon there. And so the decree talks a little bit about this type of system as well. So findings 12 in the decree talks about how floodwaters intermix with all the other tributaries in the valley. And so this whole valley can be regarded as one system. And I even touched a little bit on that, where different sloughs go back and forth, and we can divert water back and forth across different systems throughout the whole valley. And you can see from this picture, you know, some of the old channels that have existed in the past that were just filled up when we had one of these historic water years. We haven't had that in a while, so. Go ahead, next slide, please. And this is the other end of the spectrum. This is the same area. This is from one of our air photos. Same area, only 3 years later, very dry, which is just typical of this system. You know, the last few years of drought, you know, it's been difficult. There's big range of waters. This is a really snowpack dependent system. Very dependent on weather, you know, obviously no real storage. And so you're kind of at the mercy of the winter and the spring. Just a very different system. So next slide, please. Again, these are 2 different hydrographs, one from 2011, which was the photo where you saw the flood water coming out, and one from 2021. So the top one is 2011. And we peaked that year at about 3,500 CFS early in the spring. So there's a lot of water flowing through this system at that time. And you compare that to 2021, we peaked in April, I believe it was, right at 400 CFS. So almost a tenth of what it was in 2011. So it's really an extreme environment. Having really good water years makes a huge difference. So a lot of snowpack is very beneficial to the system, as you guys know. You want to talk a little bit about the basin yield? Is that your note?
Yeah, I guess I can touch on that real quick. Do you remember how many acres are covered by the decree? 260,000?
Yeah, it's about 60,000, I believe.
Yeah, so if Jason's memory is correct, the Silvies decree addresses issues water rights basically on 60,000 acres of land. So remember the duty, 2 acre feet. So 120,000 acre feet of water to fully irrigate those each year. When you get a runoff event of 400 CFS, like we did in 2021 this year, you can double the rate, and that's roughly what your acre footage is for that 24-hour period. So 400 CFS is about 800 acre feet that day. And so you can see you're going to need a lot of 400 CFS days to get up to 120,000 acre feet of water to fully irrigate these grounds. On the much bigger 2011 event, you can see that peak, approaching 3,500 cubic feet per second. Well, that's 7,000 acre feet in one day. You can see how sharp that peak was. The duration of it was not very long. It was probably only a day or two, but at least you're getting a lot more yield there. When our surface water hydrologists or scientists do the math, they'll look at the area underneath those curves over the course of the water year. And that's what tells us, when they integrate across that whole season, that tells us what the basin yield was for that particular year. And so those are really useful statistics to have, not only what was the peak flow, which is something that we can see pretty quick in the stream itself, but how much water did we actually get out of the watershed this year, and how does it compare to prior years? So those are useful bits of information to have. That's one of the reasons we run these surface water gauging stations, what we call near real-time data. We want to know continuously how much water is moving past this point, so we can sum that up over the course of the water year. And at the end of the year, our scientists can come up with the total basin yield there. So that's just a bit of the kind of the data behind the scenes, but it turns out to be very important for you when we're trying to wet up 60,000 acres. If we're not getting 120,000 acre feet, it's not happening. So.
And one other thing I'll touch on before we leave this slide is these little triangles here that we have on the graph. Those are points where we actually had people out there measuring physically in the stream. And you can see the difference there too. I mean, a lot of those measurements, we rely on access to the gauge, which is difficult to get at times, to get up there and get that measurement. So whether that's because of weather, whether it's because of the particular landowner that gauge is on, doesn't want us up there at a certain time for whatever reason, a lot of those things. So we're working on getting those measurements more frequently, and what that will do will improve our accuracy in the accuracy of the gauge up there. So you'll be able to look online and get a little bit of a better idea of what's going on as we progress through that, and we'll get a little bit more accuracy. We're working on, I think we've secured a little bit more regular access to the upper gauge, and we're also working on adding another gauge down below, somewhere near the gravel pit. If we can get access and then get through the process. We're working on putting the gauge there as well, which will help the watermaster's office get a little bit better idea of what's actually coming into the valley. Next slide, please. So what are we doing out here? And we By we mean you guys and us, or in the water master's office. What would we like to be doing? Well, we're trying to get as much efficiency out of the system as we can, given what we have to work with. We want to make sure we try to spread out as much water as we can to those that can use it and get as much beneficial use out of that water as possible. So, we don't want the water to end up in the lake without somebody having an opportunity to use it, to have a good valid water right. We try to get as much beneficial use out of the river as we can. If we can work, we want to make sure we're able to work with everybody that has water right on the Silvies or the system down here. So if we're going toward the same goal, it's always gets there a lot quicker. So having said that, any kind of delays or opportunities lost, the system, the water comes out so quick. We want to make sure we try to get it to everybody as possible. So we want to, we're out there, the water master's office is out there regulating early in the year. We want to try to be as efficient as possible. We're trying to get more staff down here so we can help the water masters out a little bit in that regard, and we're a lot more effective. We can get things done quickly. We want to make sure that the water master's office has a good relationship with everybody, so there's some trust there, and we can get things done in a timely manner. Because most of the time there's not enough water for everybody. Most years it's a struggle to get everybody wet, or even get most of the seniors wet. The 1886 priority date out here in this valley is a huge chunk of water, and that's a big wall to get over before we get to anybody junior to that. So there's a good chunk of water that has to come out before we get some of these more junior guys wet, and we'd like to do that as much as possible. A lot of times we don't even get all the 1886s wet. Next slide, please. So some of the things that our water master's office deals with, you guys all know this stuff, so I'll do this fairly quickly. Just excessive water diversion at the diversion points. A lot of the reason we put measuring devices in is so we can measure that, and it helps you guys too, because you understand what you're entitled to, what you're getting. Sometimes we'll run into folks that put in a measuring device and they're actually entitled to more than they thought, because we're actually able to measure instead of estimate what is actually flowing down the ditch. The second one, excessive water diversion from a shared ditch. So a lot of times, if you're taking water out of a lateral, we may not be adjusting that because it's down the ditch, and our authority is at the head gate on the source. So it's just a matter of neighbors getting along in that case. We're trying to share the water as much as possible as it goes down the ditch. Try to get a little bit to everybody. Another issue out here in this valley is just it's real inconsistent, real inefficient conveyance systems. Some of them, we get a lot of maintenance on some ditches, and others we don't. But it's just, with the flat nature of the valley, any kind of brush or weeds or anything in those ditches really tend to back things up, and it slows the whole system down, becomes less efficient. Again, we talked about the flat nature of the valley, 20 feet of fall over 20 miles. It's very, very flat, as you guys know. Again, use of dams, not passing water down to other users. It just, again, comes down to things get a lot simpler if you get along with the neighbors, and everybody just tries to share the water as much as possible. Sometimes a lot of times that doesn't happen, but it is very useful when it does. And water tends to flow a lot better when everybody gets along. And then in this valley, it's just difficult to avoid, but a lot of times water gets flooded across junior lands in order to get to senior lands, and just by nature of the flat valley, sometimes that happens. It's tough to keep it super tight. We'll do the best we can, but a lot of times it's unavoidable to get a little bit of water over across junior lands before all the seniors are satisfied. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick example. This is a measuring device in another basin that as much more complicated than anything that we need to deal with down here. But I just thought that was a kind of a good picture to throw in here. Is this is an irrigation district on the Payette River in Idaho. So just again, as a result of the nature of the system, measurement is very difficult. We're not going to be able to put something like this in down here. It's going to have to be a simple system like I described earlier. Try to make it as simple as possible and also accurate, so we can accurately and as fairly as possible distribute the water among users. And just, I know most of you guys know this, but we have some cost share available for those kinds of systems too. You know, and feel free to hit up the water master's office or me. We can get you the information on that, but typically we'll cost share about 50% on measuring devices and head gates. So if you guys are interested in putting that kind of stuff in, we're happy to help out with that. So we've got a pretty, I think we've got still a pretty good pot of money for.
Yeah, we can go up to 75%.
Can we? Okay, so 75%. A lot of times what that means is we'll pay for the device or the structure itself if you guys will put it in, because all of that is counted in that cost. So it's been a pretty good, pretty effective program. So I encourage you to take advantage of it if you're interested. And I haven't touched on this a little bit, but I'll go over it again, just where we prioritize measurement in the valley. We prioritize measurement on a lot of the larger ditches, places where we think we can get the most bang for the buck, or in areas where we've had issues in the past. A lot of times we'll, you know, if we do a lot of regulation on a system, maybe it's not the Sylvies itself, maybe North Fork or North Fork of Malheur. You know, we put in, or we required some measuring devices out there. It's a little bit different type of system, but we do a lot of regulation out there toward the end of the season, and the measuring devices make all the difference in the world for our guys, because it makes things more efficient. And I believe there may be a few people even taking advantage of our cost share program out there. So just we try to focus on key areas where we can, like I said, get the most bang for the buck. Next slide, please. So this is about, you know, we're getting winding down here a little bit, but one of the things we'd like to offer is maybe we could come back in spring next year, talk about what we've got for snowpack, what we're kind of expecting out of the year. So we can give you guys kind of an idea of what to expect from us. And then we can give you kind of a best guess as to what kind of runoff we're going to have, what kind of regulation we can expect for the year, those kinds of things. And then potentially maybe in the fall, we could come back again and recap what happened over the water year, where we might make some improvements, things we might need to address, where we might be focusing on further infrastructure, more measuring devices in the future, things like that, and just kind of plan for the next year. You know, we're happy to come down and do that, answer more questions that you guys might have, and get some feedback on how the year went. So next slide. You gonna go to this, or you want me to keep
I'll
going?
touch them. Yeah, this was my poor attempt to try and navigate you folks to the actual decree online through our webpage. It's really small the way it showed up in your printed copies there, and even on here. But if you do go to the main OWRD webpage, and then on the homepage, drop down to the bottom under links there, you can see a thing that I circled there called Find a Document, and then in parentheses or brackets there, the vault. The vault has images of all the decrees in the state, old state engineer orders, all kinds of really interesting things. But you can navigate to that. The next page, next slide, please, Nirvana. When you click on the vault, that first circle at the top there, you're going to want to select from a drop-down menu the water right decree, and then that'll pull up all the decrees in the state, and you can scroll through there and get down to the Sylvies River, and it's 1926. There's a number of different versions of the decree and different Supreme Court case findings and other little modifications to it. But you can find the Silvies decree and then any of the other decrees there in the state as well. So it's kind of a neat tool to pull it up. And it pulls up a big PDF image that's fairly easy to read on a computer monitor there. So
Kristen, could we work with the department and have Jeremy put on the county webpage a direct link to how to get there?
Yes, very
Okay.
easily.
So you'll be able to go to the Harney County webpage. Hopefully, if Judge Reynolds or Commissioner Doro allow, someplace there'll be a link to get to the decree. Might be easier than going through that process.
it wasn't so bad.
You might ask how many people in the room have a smartphone to start with.
Yeah.
And we'll put a sideboard on it. That's
It
bad.
was less than 10 steps.
Yeah. So that's what we've got for you tonight. I know Mary Ann, who's on the Zoom call, a number of you probably have sent her additional questions. I don't know, Mark, were you guys going to kind of?
Yeah, I got a couple questions that were submitted in advance that we'll go through first. And then I have actually a couple questions that from the outline of the presentation that I'd like to try to get more clarification. Sure. Cool.
Okay, you might need to move closer to the speaker though.
I think they can hear me.
Uh,
No? Okay.
And then they can also see you online if you stand in this area.
They all
You're online.
want to see me.
Folks.
We can hear you really well, Rep Owens, from wherever you were. So
Question, you went to some extent on where rate and duty could be measured for an individual user. But going back, where's rate and duty measured holistically on the system? One stream gauge?
Right now, one stream gauge, yeah. And then what we have, it's not part of the Sylvies necessarily. We have a gauge on Silver Creek as well. We've got two gauges on the upper Sylvies and the Sylvies Valley, above and below the Sylvies Valley Ranch. And then the one I mentioned that we're trying to get in right around 5 miles in.
So with that information, the water master can look at it, do what I consider farmer math, rate by 24 hours to come up with acre feet. What and how does the department understand potentially after March 20th, what water rights could be served? And do they put that information out before a call is made?
Don't put the information out before a call is made. Typically, depending on the water master, and in this space, we have pretty experienced water masters, so they're familiar with about how much water based on the flow is going to cover what priority days in the basin. So we typically go through that exercise. So our water master will say, say for example, there's 500 cubic feet coming out of the hills on the 20th of March. She'll know about how much of the ground that'll cover. And again, that comes back to what the weather's like, what the ground conditions are like. Some years that will go a lot further than other years. So we do the best we can to get that spread out among the users. So she's familiar, and if you have one of the maps or you want to take a look at one of the maps, it will show where the priority dates are located throughout the valley. And so she'll use that to distribute water to the senior priority dates until that flow is no longer.
Might need some more follow-up on that. I think that's interesting. Of the 1886, do you know how many acre feet of water it takes to serve those?
Not off the top of our head, but we've got a tabulation of that.
Right.
Is that on the website or anything like that? That'd be, I think, interesting for the community to know of the senior water rights, how much it actually takes even to maintain those.
Yeah.
Not getting down to the point, the last one in the stream, whether there's enough flow to get there, but having that analysis, I think, would be important.
Right. Haley, would you mind taking a note about that?
So the season specifically starts March 20th. You say you're not going to distribute or regulate before that. What can users do prior to the 20th?
We will regulate and distribute before that if people are starting to call for water. So when again, the Silvies decree recognized, here's your irrigation season, but if the water comes early and you can put it to beneficial use, you can divert it. You can't divert it beyond the rate and duty of your right. And if there's calls for water, we'll still come out and regulate that.
we will, but it has to be for beneficial use. You know, it has to meet those conditions that are outlined in the decree. If you can use it for beneficial use, you're allowed to take it prior to.
So Ivan, clarification. Jason, I believe, stated that during a freshet, so a season of real high flow, that you can exceed rate and duty. So I'm assuming there's a
Yes.
flexibility to exceed rate and duty if a call has not been made.
No,
Okay, how does that work?
if it's not a gangbuster of a year and there's a lot of water available, 2011 was it. You're still obligated to divert no more than your rate, because all the other water users are still entitled to divert theirs and generally want it. You guys have lived the reality. It's a very rare year. So my experience from 2007 to 2021, there's 1 year where everybody got wet. Everybody that wanted water got wet. And that was 2011. Every other year, there are acres who want water and cannot get the water. And so because of that, that's the norm. You know, you're obligated to divert no more than your rate at any time during the year.
You said the department figures out the amount of water that came out of a watershed on a yearly basis. Is that on the website someplace so we can look back at a period of record of 10 to 20 years, how many times we exceeded 120,000 acre feet? Because I'm assuming it was just 2011, maybe 2017.
We can, it's not readily available because of some of the delays in processing that hydrographics data. I'll have to get back to you and we'll get you guys some information on that. So
One thing I'll mention on that is those graphs that I had compared 2011, 2021 came right off our website. So those are available on our website, you know, in the near real-time stream gauge data. So anybody can go in there and look at years past and see how they compare, you know, over time.
How does the Water Resource Department regulate ditches shared by water users? Is this something the department plans to regulate as they get more resources?
okay, so right now, across the state, water masters will go to the head of a ditch where a ditch diverts water, and they'll make sure that that ditch is diverting the appropriate amount of water for the various priority dates that are down the ditch. And so we have lots of good examples here on the Silvies of ditches that have both junior lands and senior lands on it. So when the water master makes a determination that let's say 1890 and senior lands are entitled to water, we have what we call a distribution list for each of the ditches that are out there. And we know how many acres of each of the priority dates are down that ditch. And so we can drop down on the list to 1890 and we'll have a total CFS that we can send down that ditch. That's why having safe functioning head gates and measuring devices at each POD is so critical to efficiently managing the system. The water master gets to the ditch, and sometimes that's not necessarily easy. Figures out how much water is going down the ditch, makes adjustments, and then moves on to the next ditch. That's how things work efficiently and quickly and fairly through the system, where we can move through with the 2 staff that we have and quickly distribute that water to the affected priority dates there. When we put 20 CFS down a ditch and somebody with junior lands diverts that, that's an issue for those ditch users to work on. They need to go try and get cooperation with that individual. If that junior user continues to put water on those junior lands, we're going to shut the head of the ditch down and shut those lands off. And that's not good for the remaining senior users down there. The statutes set it up where if some or the majority of the users complain and want us to come manage down the ditch, they're going to have to hire an assistant water master to do that. So if the legislature hires an assistant water master to do that, then we can come down and start managing down some of these ditches. But that system was put in place because back in the day, the counties and the state never had the resources to micromanage a system. It was always set up to hit the points of diversion, make sure those PODs were compliant, and then move on down through the system. Does that make sense? No?
Well, it used to be we only had one water master and they got it covered, but now we have two. And they don't get it covered down, regulated down the ditch.
Yeah, and I don't know. I wasn't around when that happened. Don't know what was different back then or how things worked.
So currently, the resources for the department are just to regulate water to the head of the ditch to the point of diversion. If there's continued reported illegal water use down that ditch, the department has the authority to shut the water off to that ditch.
We generally try and curtail it back by the amount that the junior's taking. So if the junior's taking 2 or 3 CFS for those lands, we'll cut it back by that amount and just keep going.
Any follow-up questions on that one?
How many points of diversion?
Speak up so they can honestly
How
hear
many
you.
points of diversion would your water master regulate?
Question was, how many points of diversion would the water master regulate? I'm assuming we're talking the whole Silvies.
Yes, just what you said. I'd like to know how many.
I don't know what the number is. If you're looking for an actual number, we're supposed to be regulating all of the points of diversion down the system. So if there's a ditch with nothing but junior rights, then we'd want the head gate closed so they're not diverting anything. If there's a ditch further down with senior rights, then they would be entitled, we'd make adjustments at that one to get them the appropriate CFS for the valid senior priority dates down there.
I'm understanding all the different ones, but basically, the way I'm understanding the way that we have 800 CFS coming in, and you're getting somebody makes a call. They run around this morning and start in adjusting all that stuff. I'm wondering, is there 30 of them? Is there 100 of them? I'm guessing there's 10 to 12 of them, but I don't know that.
Okay, just ballpark, there's dozens of them on the Silvies system.
That they manage daily.
Yeah, well, it's probably more every 2 to 3 days is what the circuit takes to get around and check. And again, the Silvies system is not a typical system. So in addition to the traditional points of diversion, you're all aware there are a number of dams that are constructed to lift the river elevation to push water down those ditches. At the head of the ditch is where the head gate's supposed to be. So if there's a dam and let's say 100 yards upstream is the ditch, and we go up there and we close the ditch because it's nothing but junior users down the ditch. But the cows for the last 50 years have been walking the levee and they've tromped low spots in the levee. The water master is going to have to go start tearing boards or cutting boards out of the dam to drop the water level above the dam so it doesn't just flow out through these non-traditional PODs, if you will. And we have not taken the position of making you fix the levee in order to stop that. What we'll do is go to the control points, the dam and the ditch, and deal with it that way. But sometimes we've had to call you, the water masters had to call you to get help to get boards out of the dam to stop that from happening. So those are the 2 ways that we end up on the Silvies system controlling it, but it's a very primitive irrigation system out here. And the return on your investment out there tends to be pretty low based on what I'm told. It's relatively low protein stuff. Your yields typically are low unless it's a good water year. And so there's just not enough cash generated for you guys to put in a high-tech system. And we understand that, and we're trying to work with you within those constraints. But we have to do a better job. All of us have to do a better job of getting water to the senior lands when they're entitled to get that water. And that means we can't be stacking up a lot of water on some of the fields. We can't be having our boards and dams too early in the season. You know, as Jason mentioned, the system's going to benefit from allowing what little water comes out of this system. You know, in the wintertime, it's 15 or 20 or 25 cubic feet per second. It's nothing. For a basin as big as the Silvies is, it's very little what we call base flow. You know, before the rains hit and before the snow melt comes, that base flow is groundwater, and that basin produces very little groundwater up there. It's just the nature of the geology. That's the way it is. There's nothing any of us can do about that. But we don't get a lot of groundwater discharge like we do in the Klamath Basin or the Deschutes Basin or some of the other basins in the state. But we want to get that 20 CFS down through the system to keep that channel wetted up. So when we do get the spring runoff, we get more efficient conveyance of that water through the system down to some of the priority dates that are down towards the tail end of it there. So
There was a question about how the department regulates a junior user. They went into some depth on that. Is everybody comfortable with that, or do we need more clarification? I take silence as we don't need more clarification. Steve, you had a question?
Did I understand you, Ivan, to say that your department had a graph per se, that if there's 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 CFS coming into the basin, of how they're going to regulate the major structures to split that?
We put together a detailed chart for the Silvies Foley split as part of the litigation that started back in 2002. But in addition to that, so that's if we have an X supply coming in, this is how much priority dates are down the Foley Slough. This is how much is down the rest of the system. But each of the main ditches has what we call a distribution list on it. And so for a particular ditch, the Supreme Cut, the People's Ditch, some of the other ones, we know how many acres are down those ditches of each priority date. And so we know, let's say again, 1890s are valid and senior, those should all be getting water, you know, 100% of their share. The water master can make adjustments and send that much water down those individual ditches.
Is that public information?
Yeah, we can certainly share it with you.
Is there a way that, once again, we might be able to put that on the county website so that people can understand that? I mean, if you go
Something
there,
that
whatever it
I'd
is.
talked to him about is we also have an alert sense where a text could be sent out. So if there's a change in the system that the water master wants to notify people on, people could sign up for that text alert and she could send that information out, because I think that that's part of the problem, is the lack of clarity to the public when there's a change in the call.
So when you say a change in the call, like a change
Like it
in.
goes from 87s to 86s, or,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah.
a priority date.
Right, sure. Okay.
So there'll be more follow-up with the department as we have conversation after this and how we can better put out publicly what a feudal call was, the amount of water that's available. There's a follow-up question. I think you went on it. How can you tell the difference? How does the department differentiate between illegal water use regulation among users in a private ditch? So you stated that if there's illegal water use coming out of a private ditch, the department might go shut some of it down. How do you make that determination?
We're going to do the best we can to get out and see the water put on the ground of the junior user that's been regulated off at that point. And, you know, to follow up, if we don't get compliance, we do have the opportunity to put together what we call a notice of violation to that landowner who's taking the water and putting them on the junior lands. Our enforcement process is not the most efficient, but we can definitely start, you know, pursuing that, and have had to in some cases.
Last pre-submitted question we had is, why is Water Resource Department issued certificates for water rights like they do after a basin is decreed?
So I think what that question is asking is, why has the Water Resources Department not issued certificates for the Silvies River decreed rights? So if you recall, I talked about the decree process and then the application permit certificate process. The decree process also is supposed to end up with the water rights certificate being issued back in the day by the state engineer's office, today by the Water Resources Department. For the Silver Creek decree and the Silvies River decree, my understanding is that the state engineer had quite a bit of disagreement with the way the Harney County Circuit Court ended up with the decreed rights, meaning that the court was a lot more generous with the acres and the water rights than the state engineer's office believed should happen. And as a result of that, the state engineer's office back then and the Water Resources Department to this day never issued water rights certificates for those decreed rights. And that's just never been done. So.
One thing that the decree does say too is, it leaves a lot of power back in the circuit court. Well, obviously it's a circuit court document, but it mentions a number of times where the circuit court will need to sort of clean up portions of the decree at a later date. And I don't think that has ever happened.
Now we're going to try to open it up to questions. The talkative group.
I just have a question about when a priority date is set, it's really difficult to know what year it is, because there's never a form of communication for people to know if it's set at 1887 or 85 or what it is. I think we've asked a couple years back if there was a way that it could be put onto this county website. I know that on John Day, for example, it's on the radio.
Mhm.
And it would be nice to, not everyone listens to the radio here, I understand that, so a website would be much nicer. Some way so that people know, because, people are irrigating and maybe they shouldn't be, because maybe it's not intentional.
Right, and I think we need to work toward that. I think that's a great suggestion. And so we'll pursue that. One of the things I'll mention though is especially with regard to like the 1886 is if we have enough water to get into the 1886s, but not clear through that wall of 1886s, it's difficult to convey exactly how much of the 1886s we're going to get to. So we might, there's maybe 86s clear at the bottom of the system, and it'll be a few a call to try to get water to those guys. But here in the upper part of the system, we might be able to cover a few more of those acres. So we'll have to think about ways we can sort of, if we're down to say 1886s and we're not getting to all of them, some way to convey that as well, just to say, well, we might get to 30% of the 1886s, just to lay that out there as well. So we're not saying we're down to 1886s and then some folks at the bottom of the system that 86s aren't getting water, and then they're calling and asking why. It's because we really don't have the water for those guys, but we do have for some. So, yeah, I think that's a great suggestion.
Again, the Silvies it's a different system. It's flat and it's also really big. I'm trying to think of other systems this large that we regulate. The Klamath surface water is a pretty big drainage, but it's got a lot of flow and gradient to those streams. So it's generally more easily managed. This is unique in that you've got some senior lands down towards the bottom of the system and a lot of stuff in between it. And so what Jason's getting at is on a normal small stream system, we may have to, there may not be enough water to cover all of the senior priority dates. Let's say 1884s, there may only be 75% of the water needed to cover all of the 1884s. So the water master will apportion that out to the points of diversion where each of those PODs only gets 3/4 of what they're normally entitled to try and share that water up. In the case of the Silvies, some of these senior lands are so far down the system, if we apportion them their share, it won't get there. It'll be that feudal call scenario for them. Again, that's why it's important to try and keep the stream system wetted up through the winter months. If we're going to stand any chance of getting folks water in a situation like that, that's the best way to do it, it's through a wet channel there. But I'm curious, a quick show of hands, how many of you are on Facebook, Twitter, a few. Okay, so I think a website sounds like the best way to go. Our agency has not embraced social media. We don't do that. We've chosen not to do it to date because we really haven't had the specialized staff to get us up and running and to train all of our water masters and field staff to be able to maintain this thing on a regular basis. If we're going to build a system like this, we have to be able to maintain it, and we just haven't been able to commit to that to date. But we could certainly do something in Harney County to get the information onto the website. That wouldn't be a problem.
And what Kristen or Commissioner Shellman said, so right now, Harney County has a basis of cell phone numbers. They do an alert sense for like a wolf comfort. So a lot of users can give their cell phone number, they could go out daily. We're regulating to 1886, 30% or whatever it is. So I think the county has some systems that could help with that.
Not everybody visits the website, honestly. You know, it's one of those, and we need to upgrade our website. It might be, I mean, is there anybody that couldn't receive a text at this point, at least in the room tonight?
So my greatest comment that you made there, Ivan, I want Director Byler to pay attention. Ivan just said it was easy to manage water in the Klamath. Oh, sorry. Dave.
A gross oversimplification.
Jason, you said that where you manage is point of diversion. I get that. And then it's responsible for people down below. If you don't tell people what the priority right is, how are they going to do that? Can you answer me that, the way it's been the last 5 years?
The water master should be conveying that information to folks. She's calling a lot, I know.
Has that happened? Go ahead.
Okay, so that's something that we've been brought up a couple times, trying to figure out how the department can articulate what the priority date is for regulation. That's a follow-up. We'll figure out how we get a good system so that moves forward this spring.
You should have a fairly good idea based on the flow going down the ditch, what the priority date.
So we guess? Is that what we're
No,
supposed to do?
no, we're not. I mean, if you're familiar with the water rights on your
Yeah,
ditch,
but
then you should
okay,
have a
so
pretty
can
good
you give
idea.
us a chart
about-
that lists what the flow is? And then
Yeah,
what
we
part
can
of it?
certainly provide that to people.
That might be helpful.
Okay.
Because
Absolutely.
even in that text,
Yeah.
a link to whatever the current flow could be put out or the actual number. I mean, we can include data
Sure.
to help communicate to people, because I just think that we've got to be able to communicate. We have so many users. And unless they all just happen to talk to each other and the water master happened to talk to them that day, there's just so many people that it becomes hearsay along the way. And we want to be able to stop the hearsay.
The telephone game.
Yeah, the party line.
Steve,
And then maybe you don't want to get into it this evening, it'd be fine, but in the future, if we knew where you were focusing on cleaning areas up or placing water measuring devices, I don't think that should be any secret. I mean, you should see it coming for a year or two, that this is a problem area and let's work on it.
Okay. Yeah, it's we're working with one large owner now. Again, kind of based on staff availability and everything. We've tried not to tear into more than 2, 3, or 4 new measuring devices and head gates on any given year. I think we've gone several years without putting them in. We want to make the modest improvements necessary so the water master can efficiently regulate the system and pretty much stop there. We don't want to go beyond that. But generically, if you have a ditch, clean it out, burn it out, get the backhoe in there, do whatever you can to make it move water efficiently. If you have other users below you on that ditch, work with them to do that, cooperate together. It's anything you can do like that. If you operate dams, most of our dams have boards in them. Make sure the boards can be removed. Figure out ways so the water master can remove them safely. If she can't do it, she's going to call you to get help to do that. And time is really of the essence here. You see how spiky these peaks are. when we've got water coming down, oftentimes we only have days to try and move it around. And so if we're delayed because you don't get back to her, or you're gone, or you don't provide access to your property, we can't just come barging onto your property. We need your permission. It's best if you can tell the water master, hey, you can come on to my property anytime and go down to the river and modify the dam or my head gates. That's the easiest way for us to do things efficiently. If she has to call you and you demand that she gets permission from you before she comes onto your property, there is nothing efficient about that at all. And it creates delays which end up injuring your neighbors who are trying to get their water. So.
But Ivan, didn't the legislature give easements to the water masters to regulate water?
No.
It did not.
Nope.
To nothing.
We have access to your private property. If there's a locked gate or a no trespassing sign, we're done. If we can't get a hold of you, we have to go to the circuit court judge and get a warrant, an administrative warrant to come onto your property. We have access to your property to inspect the wells that are drilled on there. Same thing, locked gate, no trespassing sign. It's that little thing, the US Constitution and the Oregon Constitution, you have a right to privacy, and we can't reach that. So.
We have about 20 minutes left, and we'll be at this 2 hours, and my attention span gets real short at 2 hours. So does anybody else have any general questions? So what follow-up do we have, Ivan or Jason? What are we kind of work on before?
Here's a list I've got, and I know Haley's been taking notes there as well. We want to come up with, I think, a broad tabulation of the acres by priority date, and then how much water that equates to. So for all the 1886s and senior, we're going to need XCFS as an example. We can also get kind of a subset of that would be what we call the distribution list for each of the major ditches down there. That'll be broken down by priority date and the amount of water associated with that as well, and the acres. Come up with the historical basin yield by year for the Silvies system. So that'll just be a big table. Go back through, I think as far as 1925, we can go back on that and provide that. Work with the county to figure out a way to get the priority date onto the website and through the text messages that you have. And work with our water master staff to convey information better to all of you as to what the priority date is on particular ditches and how much water should be going down.
Is there something we missed? Well, the county, I'll just throw this out for conversation space to think about. The county has a natural resource advisory committee that has representation, Farm Bureau and everybody. That might be a good place for the water master to schedule to work through on how we make sure these announcements get out, how we use AlertSense, and how we start educating broadly the follow-up questions we have. I mean, this might be a good opportunity because we probably won't have monthly meetings here. These might. So any other questions or comments? If
So the change in point of diversion, what would be the process of that?
You file a transfer application to do that. Water master staff can help you get the application. It's all available online, but it's sometimes hard to navigate to that, but they can help you with that. For transfers, you have to hire a certified water rights examiner, and they'll help do the survey basically to say, this is where the POD is at today, and I want to move it upstream, 500 feet, whatever it is.
Director Byler, I appreciate you spending some time with us, even though it's virtually. Is there any comments or anything you'd like to say before we start to wrap this up?
Thanks, Representative Owens. Yes, I first of all just want to thank you, Commissioner Shellman, and the Farm Bureau for organizing this conversation. I'm pretty excited, frankly, to hear the communication. I appreciate everyone for being here tonight. I'm not sure a primer on Oregon water laws, how everyone would like to spend their evening, but I think it's a real indicator of how important water is to the community and to the folks in the room there today and tonight. And I am really encouraged by the conversation, really understanding how important it is to have good communication. I hope you took to heart the message you heard from Jason and Ivan, that we really think we think that we do our best work in terms of administering the law when we're working collaboratively and cooperatively with the water users. And you heard today and this evening, I should say, that not only is water law pretty complex and the Silvies decree nuanced, but this is a physically complex system. And the better that we can work together towards managing it, so that the folks who are under the law entitled to water have the best access and best possibility to maximize that use, the better off I think the community is. And so I'm really encouraged by the ideas that I've heard in terms of better notification systems, better communication. And we are committed to continuing to have this dialogue with you and to work towards kind of modernizing our approach and helping you all get the water that that is available to you in any given year. So thanks. I again apologize I'm not there in person tonight, but I really appreciated hearing the conversation today.
Thanks, Director. Mary Ann?
Nothing from me. Thank you all for coming and making the time. I will note, Ivan, for your list, I think the first thing that was committed to was just getting the actual Silvies decree link on the county website. So if you want to add that to y'all's short list. And then I think I'll work with Nirvana. I have about 8 pages of notes here that I took while you all were discussing, and then get the handouts in the room so that we can share those with anyone in the room who left their information on that email distribution list. So you all have good information on what was covered in this meeting and what the follow-up steps are. And we can also use that list to communicate back out any more information as the conversations continue. So thank you everyone for coming and making the time.
Yeah, I'd say thank you and follow up with Kristen, interact with Farm Bureau on questions you might not have felt comfortable talking about tonight. The department has committed to coming here, possibly spring and fall, to work through some of this. So let's continue the conversation to figure it out. Kristen?
I just appreciate you all coming, appreciate the word of mouth and getting the meeting information out. You all worked to help make this successful tonight so that it was worth their effort. It is an effort that, these folks traveled here tonight to try to make things better. And I hope that as a community, we can work together. You all may or may not be aware that there is a community-based water planning effort currently going on in Harney County. The groundwater portion of it is wrapping up and then it moves on to surface water. And so I think starting this conversation as a community is timely as we move into that phase of the community-based water planning. I encourage you folks to participate in that and be a voice in that as that moves forward. It's how we're going to make reasonable presentations to the department in the future for any potential changes that could take place. And so it is a tool that we've been given as a county to be able to work on water needs into the future. So I encourage your future participation. And like say, if you get your sign up information written down for us tonight, I will make sure to put you in a database where we can communicate that out to you as the public. So appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks.
Would you like to read it? Somebody can do.
How do you find out if I got several?
I think we can probably jump off online, guys. Nirvana, can you end the recording?